setting. Thank
Please
you.
Do that. Please do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Should I start, Pavitra?
Just a minute.
Yeah.
Okay. So participants, let us move on to the next talk. Our next talk is from Ashish Kubelkar. Ashish Kubelkar he has been the main instrumental. This workshop is possible only because of Ashish. He has taken great of course, I mean, it started because of Ashish. It has all the speakers, Professor Gupta, everybody, Tirthankar, everybody has contributed. Mr. Ashish Kubelkar obtained his master's degree in electrical engineering from VJTI, Bombay University. He was with the hardware division, R&D hardware division of Patni Computer Systems in Bombay before joining the hardware technology development group at CDAC. He is also currently developed in development of hardware subsystem for various generations of the Param supercomputer. You know, Param supercomputers are the backbone of the National Supercomputing Mission. He has been instrumental in sharing the knowledge about HPC, driving the HPC HRD program. All the workshop he has actively encouraged everybody to organize such workshops and I mean, conceptualize new workshops. Currently, he is the convener of NSM expert group on HR development and involved in coordinating the activities of the expert group and with the mandate of organizing workshops, human resource development activities among various stakeholders. You can visit the website cakes.cdac.in for many updates on the activities of the human resource development, and I am hope that he will give an excellent talk in HPC. I hope that all of you ask questions, clear all your doubts after the talk. So welcome, Ashish. Welcome to your talk. Over to you.
Thank you, Pavitra. Let me begin my talk, which is titled An Introduction to HPC. So this is the agenda. We will begin with the basics of parallel computing. Then we will see how we build a supercomputing solution. And then how when you write an algorithm or you write a code, how do you approach parallelization? What are the paradigms that are associated? And we will end up with a summary, after which you can ask questions that you have. So let's begin with the basics. So this is a basic principle on which the parallel computing works. That is, you have a large problem to solve. That's why you are using HPC. And this large problem can often be divided into smaller ones. And when you divide it into small ones, they should be such that they can be solved concurrently. So whenever you are trying to solve a problem, you have to look for this pattern. Can I break it into smaller ones? Can I run them independently? Then such problems are good to be solved using HPC or parallel computing. So once we divide it to smaller problems, and we want to run them concurrently, we need multiple processing elements. Because otherwise, as you would know, in the earlier computing systems, there was only one CPU, but using time sharing basis, you could run multiple programs one after another. That's not the case in HPC. When you have broken it into smaller tasks, then we should have as many processing elements, as many tasks we have to run concurrently. So multiple parallel processing elements is a key to doing high performance computing. Another version of this, a little different, is also called as distributed computing. So the basic concept is same. You make use of simultaneously multiple processing element. That basic principle is same. However, they are not inside one computing system, one box, but they could be isolated from each other. Like you have in a lab, you have let's say 30 computers connected using Ethernet. That's what can be used for distributed computing. But when you use it for HPC, we have a slightly different kind of networks and other connectivities, which I shall describe in the slides to come. So the take home message is divide your task into multiple smaller tasks, assign each task to one processing element. So this is the principle on which parallel computing works. Another term we often come across, which is built upon parallel computing, is high performance computing. So what is the significance of this term? As described in the previous slide, we have multiple parallel elements. So we make use of them, those parallel processing elements, for running advanced application programs. So you have some grand challenge programs, problems to solve, like you have in astronomy, you have them in biology, you have them in material science. So you have these grand challenge problems, and if you want to solve them, you can make use of HPC. So what is HPC good at? So it provides you computing technologies which can be used typically, but not limited to, like very fast numeric simulations, modeling, and data processing. Some of the examples, like weather forecasting, it includes numeric simulations to be done, and you want to do it fast, because if you want to predict tomorrow's weather, you should be ready with the results today evening. There is no charm if you get the result after one day. You would have then only verified what the actual weather was with what the results that you got. Similarly, there are modeling techniques that are used, let's say crash simulations and other things. And of course, data processing, like Professor Yashwant mentioned, SKA, or the radio telescope that TFR has built. They will have a lot of data that will be coming in, and you need to process it. And the crux of HPC lies in the mathematical calculation. So floating point calculation is what HPC is good at doing, and that is what it offers. And anything and everything that needs a lot of mathematical calculation, HPC will be your target platform to try to solve that problem. Then it gives you the ability to execute a few applications that you have decided extremely fast. So speed is one of the inherent criteria. And as Professor Gupta had mentioned, that when the earlier programs were written, they used to run for days and weeks. But today, with the newer computing system, you are able to get the results much faster. Okay. So we use this term quite loosely, supercomputer, but the definition of a supercomputer is the system that is performing at the highest operational rate as of date. Like I will give you some examples later. So the point to be noted here is, what is supercomputer of yesterday may not remain a supercomputer of today. Like when the Param 8000, the first supercomputer, was built, it had a modest speed of 1 gigaflops. Today, the mobile phone that you're carrying in your pocket has much more compute power. So what was a supercomputer of 30 years ago will not remain a supercomputer today. In fact, it will not remain a supercomputer maybe 5 years then, or 6 years when it was a supercomputer. So it's a moving target. I request participants.
Yeah, I have Ashish. I have muted everybody.
Ashish, you are also muted somehow.
Am I audible now?
Yes, please go
ahead. Yeah, okay. So we kept referring to these flops, teraflops and all. So how that's the unit for measuring the power of the supercomputer. So flop is nothing but floating point operations per second. So if you can perform one floating point operation in a second, it is one flop. But that's too low a power. Typically, we begin with something like teraflops. So teraflops is 10 raised to 12 floating point operations per second. If you remember Professor Gupta's slides, he had attached these numbers to the blocks that he had shown for the telescope, which is the radio telescope that is getting the data from the 30 telescopes that are getting data. The data needs to be processed. So some of the elements there were in the range of teraflops. You go 3 orders more, it is petaflop, and 3 orders more, exaflop. So today, no computing system today, HPC system today available is in the range of exaflop. The biggest one that we have is half a exaflop, which I will show in the next slide. So the target for exaflop was 2022, but somehow it has been missed, and maybe in a year or two we may get the first exaflop supercomputer. Then there are, you can take it further to zetaflops and yotaflops. Now, who keeps track of this, of the worldwide supercomputers? There is a website called top500.org. And how do they keep track of it? They want the new supercomputer is built. They will ask you to run a program called HPL, which stands for High Performance LINPACK. And after you run the program, it will give you a number, and that number will tell you how much exact floating point operations as measured on that benchmark is available, and based on that, this top 500 list is formed. So here is a snapshot of how things have improved. So this list began in 1993, and the triangles here represent the performance of the top supercomputer, the number one supercomputer in the world. And a straight line like this indicates that for, let's say, 5 consecutive lists, this list is published twice a year, and for 5 consecutive lists, the same supercomputer was number 1, and then there was a jump. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, this was the Earth simulator in Japan, which remained the number 1 on the list for 5 years. Then it was superseded. Like this, you will find that is another supercomputer which remained on the list 6 times, that is 3 years. And today, the top supercomputer in the world is Fugaku, which has got a HPL result of 442 petaflops, so almost half a exaflop. So it's installed at Riken in Kobe, Japan. So this will keep moving, and if you take this is the rank 500. So if you see that, if you draw a line like this, so you will find that the supercomputer which was number 1 in 1993 got out of the list somewhere in 2000. So that's the life of the first top number 1 supercomputer in the first list. That within 10 years it got out of the list. Similarly, you can draw a horizontal line and see what was the top supercomputer in, let's say, 1997 was no longer in the list in 2005. So that's how you can interpret this graph. Moving ahead, let's see how you can build a supercomputing system. What does it go inside a supercomputing system? So for that, we may like to see how it has evolved over the past 30-35 years. So an analogy could be an earth moving machine. So this is a custom built machine, and suppose, let's say, assume that in an hour it can move 1000 square meters of earth in an hour, let's say. So this is a custom built machine, and it is expensive. The whole power comes from the diesel engine that you have, what is the size of this rotor and all. If you want to build a bigger machine, you may have to take a bigger rotor and a bigger diesel engine and a bigger support system. So every time you want a bigger system, you have to invest in that. So it becomes very expensive. But over the years, in the 1995 onwards, what happened was people tried building supercomputer using commodity off-the-shelf components. So here is an analogy that you just take a JCB machine, which may be having 1/10 the power of this. But what you do, you divide the area that you have into, in this case, 9 areas. Independently, each one of them can move the earth in its given area. If you want to make 20 twice the area, just take instead of 9, make it 18. So this is scalable, and the good thing about it is because this is made in large volumes, GCB machines are made in large volume like this, you will get it at a much cheaper rate. So the 10 of these will still be much cheaper than one of these, but they will give you the same output. In this case, they are independent of each other, but when it comes to computers or processing elements, you need to connect them together. And we call that connection as a cluster, and the clustering is done using a network. Okay. So that's how things have improved. Like Cray supercomputer, which is custom built. This is, I think, XMP. The next version was YMP. YMP was much powerful than XMP, but nothing in this was used in the next one. It had to be designed again. Whereas if you take a cluster like Param UR2, in one rack, there are 9 nodes, and the total number of nodes are 244. And they are connected using a high-speed network like ParamNet. So to bring the analogy back, this Cray is like a earth moving machine. Every new version has to build from scratch, whereas this is like a whatever systems are available, good systems are available, off-the-shelf systems are available. You take them, network them together, and build a cluster. So let us see what are the components that goes in building a cluster. As said earlier, the heart of it is the compute nodes. So like Param UR2 has 244 of this. A newer system may have less of this, but it may give you more compute power because each node is powerful. So it's basically a function of money, that in the given money that you have, how many nodes you can build, and it's a scalable solution. Why is it scalable? Because you can connect a switching fabric, and using the switching fabric, you connect all of them together, and the code and data is going to come from your disks, and that you use what is called as a parallel file system. So use parallel file system because each node can independently write to some part of a file system. In a normal situation, you have, let's say you say F open a file, then only one process can read and write into it. Maybe you can make it shareable and other can read, one can write. But suppose you want a file system that allows a single big file to be accessed at various index using different nodes, then you need a parallel file system. So this is the basic thing, that code and data resides on a PFS that is used by the compute nodes, and how do they work together? Through a switching fabric. So this is what is called as a system area network. InfiniBand, ParamNet, these are some of the commonly used system area networks. So beyond that, so this is the primary network that is shown here. Beyond that, you need what is called as accelerated compute nodes. So GPUs, FPGAs, and there are various other means by which you add those elements here. So these nodes look similar, but additionally they will have a GPU card, or they may have an FPGA. Like Professor Gupta showed an FPGA based unit in his radio telescope. So that helps. Those are the dedicated nodes that can do certain operations in an accelerated mode. So more about it will be told to you by Bharat Sharma when he discusses CUDA, how to use CUDA for accelerating your workloads. So just like you have accelerated compute nodes, you also have certain nodes which contain SSD. So as you know, solid state drives are much faster than magnetic medium. Magnetic media gives you a better storage space, whereas SSDs gives you better speed. So they will frequently use code and data will be stored here. And of course, you have a tape library, which for you use for taking backups. So other than this basic things which help you in running your codes, there are other things like there are boot servers and management mode. These are used by the system administrator, which has got a separate network, the blue colored one, which is a management network. Then you have a networking gateway through which the users here can access these nodes. And since it's a cluster that you are going to use, the users, when they connect, they get into a login node, and from there they fire the job. Okay. So more about it you will learn if you are in some of the sessions, not in this workshop, but otherwise, if we take a similar workshop wherein we do a hands-on, as Professor Gupta suggested, There you will understand how you can submit jobs, and some information will be provided. Some demonstration of this will be provided by Shomnath tomorrow. Okay, so this is to be complemented by a stack. In case of a single node, you have an OS and the user. But here, the OS is typically Linux. You have a middleware which is used mostly by the system administrator. As a user, you use what is called as a job scheduler like Slurm, through which you submit the jobs. And these are the programming tools that you use for developing your code. So I may not have time to get into details, but some of these, like how you do a programming using OpenMP, MPI, that will be told to you in the next few lectures. So the point to be noted, a complex cluster like this is complemented by a software stack, which the user has to use in order to make use of the underlying hardware. Okay? So I'm sure that gives you some idea about what is there in the huge racks that you see. That comprises that of the supercomputer. So now let's get to understanding how you do parallelization. So before you get into parallel systems, first let me just tell you that there are some things that architecture designers incorporate in a single CPU, which also comes handy for the cluster in which multiple such CPU units are put. So what do? They start, like you may be aware that 8085 was one of the earliest microprocessors. It was 8-bit. Then came 16-bit, 32-bit, and today you have 60-bit, 64-bit CPU. So as you increase the ALU bits, you can crunch more number of bits in a given time. Then you can also increase the clock frequency, like you might have, some of you may be aware that 8085 or 8086 used to run at 4.77 megahertz. Then the latest processor that Intel made till they scaled down the frequency would run at, let's say, about 4 gigahertz. So 3 orders more frequency. But you cannot keep increasing them because power is proportional to the square of the frequency. So today the trend is towards lower frequency but more cores. So increase the frequency. Pipelining is an internal technique. I'll not get into that. And compilers. The compilers that make use of the features that the hardware offers. Together, all of these can help you in at the architectural level to give better performance at a single CPU. But remember that it can run a single stream of code, and we are interested in parallel computing. So because there is a limit to each of these technique, we have no choice but to use many of these elements. So we have instruction level parallelism, that is more instructions can be executed in a given CPU. How? Pipelining. I will not get into that. It's a very basic technique by which multiple instructions are running simultaneously. Then superscalar. Superscalar is a technique by which multiple execution units are incorporated inside the CPU. The first Intel CPU to have it was Pentium, and Pentium onwards all processors are superscalar. Then you have what is called as SIMD instruction, single instruction multiple data. The GPUs work on this principle. So you get better instructions in the later versions of the processors, which allow you to, in a single instruction, allow you to operate on multiple data units. So that's again an architectural improvement. And finally, as all of you are aware, that today is the era of multi-core architecture. I will explain that in the slides to come. Okay, so putting together what's inside a core what goes inside a core is first pipelining, which is a basic technique. Then you put more number of execution unit, that makes it superscalar. And then you put additional instructions which allow a single instruction to operate on multiple data. So all of this are the architectural features that are packed inside the CPU's core, and the compiler will take advantage of this. So that's the basic unit that we have today, which can further be used. Multiple of these, thousands of these can be used together to achieve higher performance. So what is there in a multi-core CPU? So I hope you can see my cursor. So there is one core here. So what is this core? This core is nothing but this, which has got all these features built inside. It has got its private cache memory. You have one more core, a simple CPU with 2 cores. Today you get CPUs with 20 cores, AMD has CPUs with 48 cores. So all of them have, these are the basic compute units. and they are connected internally through what is called as backside bus. And then this is what you see, the big blue outline is one chip, okay, or one one, you can see a processor. Okay, so it's a single computing unit with 2 or more independent processing units. So it's like a CPU in itself, which has a core, which can read and write, which can execute programs independent of each other, and there is some private memory and there is some shared memory. So this is our basic compute unit. Then using this basic compute unit, what do you do? So an example of this is an Intel Xeon processor, which will have multiple such cores. So here is an example wherein you have in a node, you have 2 sockets. So each socket has one CPU. Inside one CPU, there are 2 cores. These are simple examples. In real life, you may have more than, typically today you get 2 or 4 socket nodes. However, you may have more than 2 cores inside one CPU. So that depends upon what CPU you are using, how many nodes you have, how many sockets you have. So if you see a board like this, it has got 2 sockets. Each socket can take one processor like this. Inside a processor, there is a core. So now this will go inside a box like this. So remember Param UR2 that I showed you, and I said that in one rack there are 9 nodes. So these are 9 nodes. Inside a node, there is a motherboard. On the motherboard, there are sockets for processor. Inside a processor, there is a core. And the most important thing here is the main memory, which is shared by all the cores. Suppose, for example, you take a motherboard with 2 sockets and each socket has got 20 cores, then 40 cores can share one main memory. And when Pralay explains you about the OpenMP programming, it will be about this. That is, your code can run on 40 cores in the example that I gave you and using OpenMP. And they will communicate using the data structures in the main memory. So through a level of caches, all these cores are able to reach the main memory. So please remember this. This is one unit of computing that we have, which we call it as a commodity off the shelf node. And many such nodes connected using InfiniBand or ParamNet gives you a cluster. So I hope this concept is clear. So now why we go for parallel computing? What is our motivation? So obviously we are trying to overcome the limitation of a single CPU system. So what is that we gain out of it? We gain speed. Why? Because sequential systems are slow. They will be able to run only one set of code. And as Professor Tirthankar mentioned, Professor Paddy had started the work and he would run it on a single computer and it would take days. And then when you can put more CPUs, you can divide the task, and like if you have more hands, your job gets done faster. So that is the first motivation. You get a higher speed. Second thing is, every sequential system will have a limited memory, but your data is huge. So the data will not fit in the memory. It will be on the secondary storage in the virtual memory. If you want to bring it, put it back, because of limited main memory, you are spending a lot of time in moving just the data. But you have more CPUs, each one of has its own memory. So the cumulative memory is, total memory is large. So what do we gain out of this? You save time, run your code faster, and you can also solve bigger problems because you can take advantage of the more memory you have, fit the data, access it to the distributed CPUs that you have, and gain performance. So that is the basic reason why we go in for parallel computing. Okay. So now once you have acknowledged that we can use this parallel processing elements to gain performance, to solve bigger problems, let us see how we can do it. So the ideal situation is that you have multiple processing element. Each processor has unique work to do. That means it is not dependent on data which is provided by other, which means that there is no need for communication. There would be some in the beginning to distribute code and data, However, while it is running, it doesn't need the code and doesn't need the data which is held by other CPUs. And all processors do equal work. That means the job is such that you have divided it equally among all the processors. So they begin together, they finish together, and the job is done. But remember, this is ideal situation. In practice, you will have certain constraints. And for that, we use certain methods or algorithms to attack the problem and break it into smaller problems. I will describe each one of them in the slides to come. Let's begin with the phase parallel. So what phase parallel model does is that it breaks the algorithm into a number of super steps. Each super step has two phases. One is called as compute phase, that is shown here, and they are independent. So each compute phase is being run on each processing element. And once they are finished like this, if assume that the scale going from top to bottom is time. So each processing element does computation, and when its job is over, it waits. When all of them are finished, they do interaction. So this is synchronous. That means all of them talk to each other. Then again, they independently do the task. Then again, they talk to each other. So in the interaction phase, as Professor Preeti will tell you, you have something called as a barrier or a blocking communication, where those who finish first, they wait. They wait for others to finish. So that's why in the previous slide, I mentioned that all process do equal work. If all process do equal work, then the time taken by each one of this computation time will be equal. But that is not the case. Some have to do last longer, some do fast. So the one that finishes last, then the synchronous interaction takes place. Then comes the divide and conquer model. So like there is a parent. The parent divides the work among his two children. The children themselves divide the work among the two children, that is grandchildren of the root process. When they finish, they return the result to the parent. The parents return result to the root, and this kind of thing is useful for certain kind of computations like quicksort. Okay, so again you will see that there are, in this case, there are 6 processing elements, rather 7 processing elements if you take the root in also, and then they are doing tasks, and then one of them is collecting, then passing it to his parent, and thus the root gets the results which are distributed to children and grandchildren, and this level can be increased, that you can have great grandchildren as well. Third model is called as pipeline model. So this is useful when the data is streaming, like the SKA or the giant meter wave radio telescope. A data stream is coming continuously. You divide the task into multiple tasks such that the output of first stage goes as input to the second stage, and the output of the second stage goes as input to the third stage. You can, an analogy could be the assembly line of an automobile. You start with a chassis, let's say, then you put the engine, then you put the seats, then you put the tires, and so on. So the chassis moves over a assembly line from one station to another. Here the data moves from one module to another, and continuous data is coming, and continuous data you get output from R. Okay. So that is another model. This is similar, farm process model is similar to the divide and conquer model, except that you have only one master and just 2 levels of hierarchy, master and slave. So master distributes the task, worker give back the task to master. So master will be slightly more powerful than the workers because it is communicating with multiple workers. Okay. So this is also understandable that the division of the work is done by the master or the root. And finally, document decomposition. Professor Somnath will describe that tomorrow morning. So this is useful in solving a boundary value problem, wherein you split it into multiple subdomains, and then there is a communication at the boundaries, and this will be explained to you by Professor Somnath tomorrow. So when you choose an algorithm to solve a problem, then you need to look at certain attributes in the algorithm that you are choosing, or the way you are designing your grand challenge problem into converting into an algorithm and then writing the code. First is the concurrency. If you don't have concurrency, then that particular algorithm, I mean, howsoever many number of nodes you put, you are not going to get any improvement because it is essentially a sequential program that you have. So if your algorithm has to have concurrency, only then that is suited for being solved by HPC. So you should look for ability to perform actions simultaneously. This is what one should be looking at in the algorithm or the problem that you are trying to solve. Second important thing is scalability. Scalability means that suppose today you have 2 compute units, you are dividing the task half of 2 units. Then you get 4. You should be able to divide the task into 1/4 and give it to 4 units, 16, 32. As the number of processor count increases, your algorithm should be able to scale. Not all algorithms scale, some of them hit a plateau after certain number of nodes because the algorithm inherently cannot scale. So scalability is a good or very important attribute to have incorporated in your algorithm so that whatever number of processors you can have access to, you will be able to solve the problem faster or will be able to solve a bigger problem. Third thing is data locality, meaning that the data should be locally available. You may recollect I have shown L1 cache which is tied to processor core. So if your data can fit into that, your processing will be faster. However, it's not always possible and some data will be available in the neighboring processor, in which case you have to have additional delays in getting that. And modularity, that is anyway an attribute that any programming model should have. That is, you should be able to decompose your complex problem into smaller ones so that debugging and improving performance, etc., becomes easier because you are handling it at the module level. You improve the module, you improve the algorithm, the module, or you scale the module, and then that will add to the overall performance of your algorithm. Because each module is being handled independently, that makes it easier to take care of a module rather than having one big program and trying to, that's anyway an attribute that any software programmer would incorporate. So how do you write the parallel code? This is a very high level view, but more details will be provided later. First is when you start, there is one process that will distribute data to the memories of the individual processors. The code will also go to them. Then they will run parallelly. This code will run on the processors in parallel, but you will have to organize the workflow, synchronize it, and then incorporate some intelligent things. Like there are 2 important things that happen: compute and communication. So an easy thing that is always followed is you overlap compute with communication. That is the data that you need for the next computation. While the previous computation is on, get the data and store it nearby. So such kind of techniques, or in pipelining, have a buffer such that the processed data by the previous stage is readily available for the next stage. So these are some of the techniques that you need to use intelligently so that none of the compute element or the communication element is starved of data. It is not waiting for any event to happen. It's what it needs is available a priori. So this is easy to say, but one has to really work hard to make this happen. And there are tools that are available that tell you the hotspots, etc., which you will get to know when you look at the advanced programming techniques. So what are the frameworks that are used for parallel programming? OpenMP. Remember, this works only for shared memory computer, the node that I showed you. And how do you achieve this? Through compiler directives. Professor Pralay will give details about this in the next lecture. MPI, it is suited for distributed memory computers, the clusters that I showed you. For this, you need to make use of MPI libraries. And there are other open source methods like OpenACC, which is used for accelerator. It is again compiler directive based. And you will learn about CUDA, which is specific to NVIDIA, and newer techniques like OpenAPI, OneAPI, which is Intel is proposing. They will come soon, and then you will have, maybe we can have a separate training for that. So these some of these details will be not OpenACC, but OpenMP and MPI will definitely be covered, and CUDA will be covered in the next 2 days. So to summarize, let's acknowledge that parallelism is a fundamental technique of HPC. Inherently, human mind is tuned towards sequential programming, sequential thinking, but this has to be incorporated. So thinking parallel is a key to writing better parallel program. Then scaling up is an important need, because you are going to solve grand challenge problem, which you are going to have big data or big compute that you are going to need. So you need to make proper use of the communication network and the software stack that is available to you. Traditionally, increasing the performance was done through increasing the number of CPU, like Param UR2. There were no accelerators using it. But today you have accelerators, like NVIDIA makes accelerator, you have FPGA accelerator, there are specific accelerator for AI. So they use lightweight cores. But then you have to then write the code in such a way that part of the workload is taken by the CPU and the part of the workload is taken by the accelerator. So what are the key ingredients? Appropriate algorithm. You have a problem to solve, convert it into algorithm, which has to be inherently parallel and scalable. Then once you have the algorithm, use a combination of frameworks. Like the most popular one today is OpenMP plus MPI. So use within the node, use OpenMP, across the node MPI. Or some use OpenACC, which hides the interfaces, but the performance may be slightly less, because you are trying to use a simpler technique. So whatever is the underlying hardware, that the communication network, the CPUs, the accelerator, you have to take advantage of that by using appropriate framework and derive optimum performance. So that's all I have in the time that we could manage in. We still have some time for taking a few questions, and this is my email address in case you want to get in touch with me. So I will now stop sharing my screen. Thank you. Let us see if
Thank you, Ashish, for the excellent question. So for the excellent presentation, we got enlightened, and this is a very nice introduction to the topic of high performance computing. We have some questions. We will be able to take only few. So Sahil, can you please unmute yourself and speak?
Yes, sir, can you hear me?
Yeah, please go ahead with the question. Yeah, no introduction.
Right. So I was trying to understand if we use like OpenMP or MPI, do you recommend to use hyperthreading also on top of that? And the second question is, do you have any comment how performance can be changed with compiler flags? These are my two questions. Thank you.
Yeah, very good question, Sahil. Hyperthreading is discouraged, because hyperthreading, in fact, in like Param Shakti, that's at Kharagpur, at BIOS level, hyperthreading is disabled, because what happens is hyperthreading has its own overheads, and it's ideal that the compiler and the user takes control of parallelism rather than giving it to the CPU, because at the end of the day, hyperthreading is converts one physical CPU core into two virtual cores, but the core remains one, the physical core remains one, and it's better that the compiler and the user takes control of it rather than the hardware takes control of it, because in case of hyperthreading is useful for workloads like web processing, etc., where you have lightweight threads and they may be waiting for data to come from hard disk and all. In such case, the hyperthreading is useful, but not in case of HPC. And coming to the second question, compiler flags, yes, they play a big role. And some of these things will be explained to you in the demonstration, in the sense that some of the things are for a given situation, you may have to do some trial and some trials and see which one suits you best. And that the tools that you get along with the compiler, like they give you an insight as to which routine is taking more time, or where the parallelism is possible. So along with the tools, the compiler flags together will help you in deriving better performance. Okay. So Shumit Banerjee, you have also raised hand. Can you ask the question?
Thank you, sir. Sir, my question is, there are two questions again from my side. The first question is, how do we ensemble the output from the individual compute cores after they have completed that execution? And the second question is, in case of certain programs where the input of one process is the output from a different process which is already happening, so how do we convert those challenges into the parallel computing paradigm?
Okay, so to answer the first question, that has to be managed by the programmer. In the sense, suppose like we take the example of offline processing of data gathered by GMRT. So you have that data, and let's say you are looking for certain pattern inside that data. Then what you would do is you would distribute the data. Let's say you have some 5 TB of data, you have, let's say, for example, 50 processors to you. So you will divide the data among them. They will keep reading, and the output has to be written to a file. Okay, so typically the HPC programs that you run, they do a read from a file, process it, and write to a file. And then what is to be done with it? Many a times you need another program to analyze the output. Like in some cases, you may visualize that output. Let's say if it's weather forecasting, which has a time series data that has been put in the output, then you may display it in terms of how the clouds are moving or how the pressure is moving over a period of time. So it has to be handled by the programmer, the who's writing it. That is, input and output have to be handled and by the programmer. In the sense, typically it is read from a file and written into a file. Okay, that's where the parallel file system comes into picture. So that's the answer to the first question. And the second question that you asked, I just forgot. Can you say that again? The second question.
Yes, sir. The second question is, for example, if there is a program
pipeline, right. Okay, again, see, the pipelining can be done. There are various ways of doing it. Basically, look at it this way. That is as a one block, which is, let's say, reading from the file and generating intermediate data. Now, the size of the intermediate data will determine whether it can reside in the memory or it has to go to a file system. So the easiest way is to put it in a file system. And the way you can do it is, one of the ways that it is handled is like this. Let's suppose it's a 3-stage pipeline and you have 30 nodes at your disposal. Then the first 10 nodes will do the first stage. They will write the data in an intermediate file till some part of that data is assembled in the intermediate file. Second set of 20 nodes, they will wait. Once they have got the data, they will start processing. Till such time, the third stage will wait. I hope you are able to get how this is happening. So in this example, one way of doing this, as I said, is writing into an intermediate file, and one process or one set of process has got a write access, other set of process has a read access, and then through appropriate pointers, you keep track of what is read and where the read pointer is moving, where the write pointer is moving. If you want to, another way of doing it is have it in a shared memory. So that will make it much faster. But then you may be doing small chunks of data, generating small chunks of output data, which can reside in the memory, process it, and then write. The last stage would be writing into the file. So the first stage reads it in the file, the intermediate stage writes it into memory, and the last stage writes it into again the file. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank
you. So just maybe we can take 2 more questions. Suman, can you unmute yourself and speak?
Thank you, sir, for your nice talk. I would just like to ask whether there are any plans around for making supercomputers with microprocessors made in India other than Intel, like Shakti. So if yes or no, whatever, how far we are from that point. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Suman. There is a plan to develop a HPC processor also under NSM. And once that HPC processor is developed, most likely it will be ARM based, and it will be used, because what happens is the Shakti processor and Vega, which is also Shakti is made by IIT Madras and Vega, both based on RISC-V. they are more targeted towards embedded system because they have 2 and 4 cores. The HPC processor that we are talking about will have large number, maybe in excess of 50 cores, and a system is planned to be built using this. More details will be available as and when they are declared, but there is a plan to have an India-made processor-based HPC system under the Atmanirbhar program of Government of India.
Thank you.
One more question.
One more. Yeah, Adrija, can you unmute yourself and speak? Adrija?
Hello, am I audible, sir?
Yeah,
Yes,
you are
Aditya,
audible.
please go ahead.
Sir, I have the question that these huge amount of computations, do they emit a huge amount of heat? If yes, then what are the measures taken to manage this?
Okay, good question, Adiraja. And that's one of the reasons why I just said that the CPU vendors are not increasing the frequency, because power heat that is generated, there is something called as, every CPU has got is called as TDP. TDP stands for thermal design power. A typical CPU, HPC CPU will have it in the range of somewhere around 150 to 180 watts. And beyond that, you need liquid cooling and all to remove the heat effectively. So it is not recommended to increase the frequency too much. So while frequency is one part, amount of silicon that is put there, how many billions of transistors are put there, they also determine how much heat is generated. So there is always once upon a time there was no attention given to the power that was consumed, because most of the power is converted into heat, and taking the heat off the CPUs is a challenge, because otherwise it can, due to basic principle of physics, it can get into thermal runaway if the temperature is not controlled. So the trend today is trying to see a metric called as flops per watt. Once upon a time it was just flops, and flops, just keep increasing the flops. But today an eye is kept on how much wattage is going to be consumed. And there is a unit called, what they are trying to see is, in a data center, the power that goes into data center is used for two purposes. One is computation, that is what the CPU consumes, which is called as IT load. Another is a non-IT load, which consists of UPS, which consists of air conditioning. And the trend is towards reducing the power for these non-IT loads. And more and more power, if it can be consumed just by the IT load, that will give you a better efficiency. So your question is right, that it is very important that the heat is kept under control because of two reasons. Safe operation. If the heat increases, the system will shut down, because there is an automatic method by which if the temperature goes beyond a certain limit, the CPU shuts down automatically. So you don't want that to happen. So heat is to be controlled, and heat is like it is a waste of energy in that sense. So you would like to avoid that. Okay, over back to you, Pavitra.
No, just one more question. Asha Lakshmi has been asking for a long time. So, Asha Lakshmi, madam, can you please speak? Yeah, Asha Lakshmi. Okay, maybe others can mail the questions to the specified email, which we have already sent you. We will forward it to the speakers, all the speakers. You can always mail me. For the sake of time, we are moving to the next talk, and but you can always ask the question. And we'll also have interaction sessions in the panel discussion sessions where you can ask the questions. All right. So thank you, Ashish. Thank you for the excellent talk. It is always a pleasure to talk to you.